Welcome to the Big Ideas lecture series from the Dorr School of Sustainability. My name is Arun Majumdar. I'm the dean of the school. And as you know, the school is the first one that Stanford has launched in 75 years. And there was a lot of planning that went into it because there was no game plan before that. So it required a lot of work to get it launched, and we did launch in fall of 22. And it has a vision to create a future where humanity and nature can thrive together. If I may just spend a few minutes just talking a little bit about the scale of the challenge. We have 8 billion people in the world, going on to 10 billion by mid-century, a $100 trillion economy, which is growing, and roughly 80% of that is powered by fossil fuels, which is leading to climate change. And the urgency of climate change requires that we want to address it with some new paradigms. New paradigms in sustainable development and adaptation measures for communities, especially the underserved ones, restoration of nature, all of this in the next few decades. This is a transition. This is the biggest transition and transformation humanity has ever undertaken. This is going to affect every human being and every organization, institution around the world. And we are in the early days of that right now. So looking at this and trying to introduce changes, this cannot be achieved by extrapolating the past or making small incremental changes. We need some big ideas in innovation, which is why this Big Ideas lecture series was created in the first place. It is our opportunity, a special opportunity, to bring global thought leaders to Stanford to consider matters of Earth, climate, and society, and with particular emphasis in engaging the whole Stanford community. And that is because sustainability, while we have launched a school, spans the whole campus. In fact, spans the gamut of human experience. It is not just a business issue or an engineering, or law, it is all of the above. And so it requires a full Stanford campus engagement. Last October, this series got launched by a conversation between Bill Gates and our own Tom Jaramillo. And it is really a pleasure to welcome our own alum, JB Straubel, as a global thought leader to come and discuss in this Big Ideas event. JB? Good to see you. You too. So we're going to have a conversation, and as you know, JB is the founder, a co-founder of Tesla. He's now the founder and CEO of Redwood Materials, which is the largest recycler of lithium-ion batteries. He's so passionate about sustainability, and most importantly, he's a Stanford alum. So welcome back.
Thank you.
We're going to have kind of 3 stages of this. We're going to first talk about JB's journey from Stanford and all the way beyond. And then we'll talk about sort of where does this all, if you look at the global landscape, where does a Tesla or Redwood Materials, what lessons are drawn that can be used for the rest of the world, the big picture. And then we have a bunch of questions from students and some faculty and staff, which we will go through. So let's start with you. I know that we had a conversation last Friday, and I said, I really don't like talking about myself. I said, well, let's start with that. So tell us about your experience at Stanford and what it meant to you now that you look back.
Well, First of all, thank you all for being here. It's great to be back, and thanks for braving the rain to be here. I had an incredible experience at Stanford. I absolutely loved it here, and it was formative for me. It really launched me, targeted me, I think, in a lot of ways on the problems that I was passionate about. And I knew I loved engineering and science and data and technology. I didn't know quite what to do with that when I came into Stanford, and through a number of early classes, some from Jane Woodward and others who are in the audience here, I really sort of found some of my passion areas, and energy and sustainability specifically. And Stanford was just this incredible place that was sort of a combination of freedom to explore and do all kinds of different things, and look into different disciplines. It was also in this incredible environment, it still is, of one of the leading states in the world adopting energy efficiency and adopting alternative energy and adopting electric vehicles. So this was a really, I think, formative place to start to study some of those things for me, and that really launched me and got me excited.
So the course that you took from Gill Masters was something quite special to you. Tell us about it.
Well, there were a whole series of courses there, and they were basically teaching about the broad background of electric power, and also about energy efficiency. And I sort of really had the chance to go deep and understand each one of these topics, and just fell in love with it again. It was very hands-on and project-based. I'm a very hands-on person, so I loved the ability to be in a lab and actually testing solar panels and testing pumps and testing batteries. I was so excited about that. I ended up TAing for him, I think, the next year, and didn't even want to leave the lab. And I think I ended up staying in his little tiny lab a whole summer. He almost had to kick me out of there, but it was really fun. And Stanford was this kind of chance to really go deep in these topics. And I think it's something I hope all students take advantage of a little bit, because it's not always obvious that those opportunities are here. I think they still are. But that's one of the remarkable things at Stanford. And I ended up designing my own major here. I'm not very good at fitting into sort of specific roles or tracks. So that opportunity at Stanford was also really perfect for me, and Gil was my advisor.
And is it true that you used to take out engines from cars and put batteries and motors and make them electric? Tell us about it.
I absolutely used to do that. I was happily converting and rebuilding all kinds of vehicles that had batteries or motors. When I was here, I rebuilt an old Porsche and made it into an electric car and converted that fully into electric. And also used that as a chance to really learn about the components. There was kind of an underground movement of people building these things back in those days. You couldn't just go to an OEM and buy an electric car. So it was the sort of realm of ultra nerdy people who would sort of go to these little meets and talk about the things they had built. I built my own charger, I built my own motor controller and wrote the software for it. So it was a chance to really get in the weeds and understand exactly how it worked and what things didn't work. Even back then, it highlighted that batteries were probably the core limitation of a lot of those electric vehicles, even things like home conversions.
And this is lead-acid batteries that you were dealing with.
That was the beginning of it, yeah. But that was the status quo not that many years ago. This isn't 50 years ago. This was maybe 20, 25 years ago. But still, it was not that long ago, and it was still the best technology that was out there.
So this is late 90s you're talking about, right? And when the Valley was booming in the .com, in fact, the Netscape moment, if I remember correctly, was 1997 when Netscape went public and all hell broke loose. And you were creating the Tesla moment at that time. Little did you know that you were doing it, but you were actually involved in the next phase, right? Is that?
In hindsight, yeah, that is kind of the timing. And I think that's an interesting thing about entrepreneurship generally, is that it is kind of contrarian in the beginning, and it's not obvious at all. I was, sleeping at the solar car site and, spending time, rummaging through batteries and converting old cars, while, most of my, friends or a lot of my, compatriots were, were rushing to Google or starting a new, web company or something or other, and usually making a fortune doing it, very successful. But there's kind of these cycles, and the very beginning of usually technology and entrepreneurship cycles is not very intuitive. It's not so sexy. And anyway, it was that time.
So when you graduated, tell us about your journey from there to a company called Volacom, and then to Tesla. Tell us about it.
Well, I was just reflecting right before this. I don't think I ever had a real job, so to speak. I'm not a very good employee. I also don't think, in the typical sense. I basically graduated from college and frankly didn't really know what to do. I felt a little aimless. I was very good, I think, at understanding the environment here and the freedoms here, but then, I didn't want to just go to a normal big company. So, I started a whole number of different projects. I actually kind of tagged along with the solar car team for another 1 or 2 years until, again, they were kind of awkwardly like, you really need to leave. And, I did engineering consulting for some of my friends' companies, and I built little products at night and made enough money to pay rent. But I also, started another small company, which was Volacom, that airplane. It was an electric airplane company, somewhat before its time, and it was with a gentleman I had interned with, several years previously, by the name of Harold Rosen, who was a quite famous and wonderful engineer and mentor. But it was ahead of its time, and I didn't know what I was doing. I was 1 year out of college and had never done any company, and I think he was about 75 at the time. So we were an odd couple, but really had a lot of fun. And the most impactful part of that is that it led both of us to meet Elon Musk, and that was only back in about 2003, so maybe about 2 years after I graduated.
And Elon was looking at electric planes, or how did that happen?
No, he actually wasn't at all. That was kind of the problem with that meeting. But I thought it was going to be a good idea, and he was on the cover of some magazine, having sold a company for $1 billion, PayPal, I think it was. So I thought, I need to talk to this guy, and I actually met him after a talk at Stanford. That was the first time we connected, and I was, furiously pitching the electric airplane idea to him, and he had absolutely no interest in it. But then I pivoted that, over the course of a lunch discussion into talking about another project I was doing, which was trying to build a very long-range electric car that could drive several thousand miles by stringing together thousands of laptop lithium-ion batteries. Sounds like a very normal project, right? And he loved it. He immediately got it. And I was kind of shameless in those days, just telling everybody I could talk to about this stuff, seeing if anyone would give me a few $1,000s. And I'd roped in a lot of the solar car team to help do this project. Elon loved it. He immediately, wrote a check to help with that project, and that over the course of a few weeks of corresponding after that, really the beginning of Tesla came together.
And this is around which year now we're talking about?
2003 or so.
2003 or so. At that time, lithium-ion batteries were there, of course, but they were very expensive. So did you do, when obviously you're both engineers, did you do the calculations as to how fast lithium-ion batteries cost need to come down? Or what went into that discussion?
Well, it was, I'd say, on my side, I was looking more at the technical aspects. Could we even make this thing work? And, could they be safe enough? Could we have enough power and energy density and the architecture of a giant pack? No one had ever built a battery pack that big and put it in a car, anything with wheels. So there were a whole number of firsts that had to be crossed. The long-term economics of it, there was sort of a case study looking at the materials involved in the battery, and we could sort of show that it didn't have a bunch of gold or platinum as fuel cells did at the time. And there wasn't any reason that we could see why it couldn't be cheap over time. But it was audacious to imagine that it would be, because we were literally, sort of riding the coattails of a very early laptop industry. And it wasn't without problems either, because those early laptop batteries tended to catch fire, they had recalls, they it was kind of a challenging time, to convince people that it was a good idea to put many more of them in a car.
I mean, now it seems, of course, obvious, but at that time it was not. And it was kind of a risky proposition. And yet you convinced investors that this is a good idea. And how did he manage that, in addition to Elon's investment?
Well, it was very, very hard, actually. And in the beginning of Tesla, if you think of 2003, 2004, clean tech wasn't even a term. This term had not been coined yet. I don't know who coined it, but it certainly wasn't around then. And there was zero appetite for this. Myself and a few of the other co-founders at Tesla, I vividly remember literally walking from parking lot to parking lot up and down Sand Hill Road. We'd go from one VC to the next, and you kind of duck through the hedgerow and kind of pretend you didn't just come from go from Kleiner to whoever else. But basically no one was interested. It was just hopeless. And frankly, Elon, was pivotal. That one of the things he really, I think, can take a lot of credit for was, having the vision to be there in the very beginning and risk a lot of his, personal assets at a time when no one else would touch this thing. It was just nuts building a car company in Silicon Valley.
So of course, in the early 90s, GM had this electric car made of lead-acid batteries, et cetera, and then they killed it. I mean, there's a famous movie, Who Killed the Electric Car? Did that play any role? I mean, there was an automobile industry out there, the big three, and this would have taken them on, right? And how did you solve that equation?
It played some part. Frankly, back then, GM was here and we were here, and it just felt like it was different worlds.
Okay.
We were trying to do things from a really bottoms-up, grassroots, technology, level. It really evolved out of, solar car technology more than it did evolved from, a GM as an OEM. I used to actually go and collect junk parts from EV1s. I don't think I've ever told anybody that. But I would find that I could go to the dealerships and they didn't even know what to do with the old parts, so they would just give them to me. So I used to collect the old motors and some batteries and parts like that. So it kind of felt like we were almost this like underdog, like living, outside the automotive industry, trying to really prove that there could be a different way to do something. It wasn't as if we were like head to head with GM on day one.
Which is a good place to be when you're starting something. Stealth in many ways, right?
Yeah, stealth by, yeah. Everyone ignored us completely because it was so crazy.
So then there was a decision, I suppose, that was made where you would go for the high-end Roadster as opposed to the equivalent of EV1. So tell us about how that decision was made.
It was pragmatic, really. I mean, it was the only thing we could make. The vision for the company and the team was very much about sustainability. And, we felt that, this was something that we needed to demonstrate, to the world. And we kind of had this audacity to go and prove to the industry and prove to the world that it could be done. That was, I'd say, more the mindset in the beginning was, we're going to, show everyone that electric cars can have enough range, they can be desirable, people will actually want to buy them. Because the narrative that had really, taken over in those days was the opposite. It was that, they can't go anywhere, they're slow, they're kind of the inferior technology. And it was brutally expensive. We couldn't build anything that was, cost efficient, even close to it. But we could build things that were high performance. So we kind of, looked at the sort of, Venn diagram of what we could make and what we could possibly make it for, and there was like a very narrow spot right in the middle, which was like, well, we can make a high-performance sports car and might be able to sell it, at the price point someone might buy. So we kind of aimed right there.
Talk about high performance. The first time I met JB, I think it was 2009, you may or may not remember, I went to your factory in San Carlos, and Elon had a desk, I think, and you guys all had desks out there. And then he said, okay, you want to go for a ride in Roadster? I said, sure. And so he said, well, why don't you, and I was sitting in the passenger seat, he said, why don't you try touching the front in a panel out there? So I went like this, and then he put his foot on the pedal, and it just went back. And that was my first experience with JB, is the acceleration of a battery car, EV. And that was just absolutely fabulous. And so that became, and what did that teach you that led to Model S?
Well, it was a steady, progression and maturing of the technology, maturing of the integration of the whole thing. We had to, in those days, retire almost all the technical risk. The Roadster was about demonstrating that this product could even work. And that was the fundamental mission of that vehicle. And also that we could have enough of a market, but it was a few thousand cars. It was tiny. And from Roadster to S, it was saying, okay, well, we demonstrated that we could do this. It technically can work. And a lot of people, by the way, were literally just calling us liars. I'd never experienced this before. This was kind of bizarre. I was an engineer, and I'm saying, well, we designed this thing, and here's this math, here's the spreadsheet, and they're saying, no, you're lying. It can't do that. And I was thinking, well, I don't know how to respond to that. It's like, okay, we'll build it, I guess. So the Roadster really demonstrated that this was real. But the Model S was a whole another scale. And it was really almost 2 orders of magnitude increase in volume. So it was a major step up, and moving into a market that was really more utilitarian. The Roadster was fun. Some people tried to use it and did, but it was was very small. So the Model S, we had to really get into vehicle engineering. That was a brand new thing. With the Roadster also, we didn't do much of the vehicle engineering. We outsourced that to Lotus Cars in the UK. And then with the Model S, we had to expand and suddenly build this vehicle engineering team. So yet again, we had a bunch of skeptics and people at the car, throughout a lot of the OEMs who kind of just poo-pooed the whole thing and were quick to tell us this was nuts. You can't possibly build a car because you've never built one before, and what does this team know about building cars? They were right on one hand. It was much harder than we expected. We made a ton of mistakes and really had to rebuild things a lot of times, but that didn't mean it was impossible. And we actually did pull it off, and I think that kind of the naivete and fresh look at how to do everything was actually hugely beneficial in the end. Because if you're in a large OEM, you kind of get the proverbial handbook of here's how you design the next car. And it's sometimes a bit hard, I think, to be creative and to break out of that. Because they'd say, oh, no, we can't do it that way because we saw another problem 10 years ago that emerged if you ever did that other thing. And we were just totally ignorant of that. We just ran into all those problems, and lo and behold, some of them were actually solved over time, and technology had kind of enabled different things to go and have a different outcome.
And I think when Model S came out, people realized that this is serious. And it created a whole brand of luxury cars. And you were competing with Mercedes, BMWs, and others, but in a very different, it was considered a luxury car. Yep. And there was another very important decision. There were, I'm sure, many decisions that were made, but a big one, at least from the outside, is the creation of the Gigafactory. And tell us about it, because this was new in many ways.
Well, maybe just one comment on the competition with the luxury brands before we go to the Gigafactory. In the early Model S days, we actually were trying to encourage the other car makers to adopt EVs. In fact, we actually did some co-engineering projects and built components for them. Daimler or Mercedes was an investor in Tesla in the beginning and a supporter. I vividly remember taking one of their heads of engineering for a ride in our prototype S, and just I was just amazed. I thought this was going to convert them in a second. They'd be wowed by this thing, and they'd see the light. It couldn't be farther from the truth. They kind of got out of it and were like, well, this will never work. You can't charge it. It's too heavy. This and that, and they came up with 50 reasons why this was not relevant and wouldn't really compete. And that was an incredibly interesting lesson. And I was sort of learning this lesson of just the incredible power of inertia of large companies. And I think this is quite relevant today in the fossil fuel industry. Maybe we'll come to this eventually, but I somehow I thought that, as we demonstrated technologies or innovation and kind of put it in front of, the existing companies that had all the resources, they could have done what Tesla did, and Tesla, probably would not have been successful or been very small. But they never did. And they, instead they kind of ignored it, they delayed, they kind of equivocated and waited another almost decade, half a decade at least, before starting to respond. And that gave Tesla the runway to kind of be dominant as it is today. But
they were investors in your company, in Tesla. So tell us, isn't that contradictory?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's different levels of approval and sort of engagement and investment. I think, I can't remember the exact amount, maybe it was 50 million or so that Mercedes invested in Tesla. From us, this was huge. I mean, whole $50 million, this was incredible. This meant they were on board, they were going to support it, and we're like, we're going to the moon, they're commercializing this with us. On their side, I think this was more of a experimental kind of toe in the water of maybe we'll give some money to this group of crazy people just to see how crazy they are, and I think it kind of had that feeling internally, and so I guess when you see a large company make some investments, I think you have to put it in the context of what's their total R&D budget, what's their total revenue for the year. I think if you distill it down to 1% of those kind of metrics, it's more impactful and meaningful of what does it mean for their organizational commitment on something.
I'm sure they're very thankful for the return on their investment, given the stock price of Tesla.
Well, had they held it, perhaps. I don't know how long they held it for. I don't know, but I'm sure they did well. I don't think it was a bad outcome.
So let's talk about the Gigafactory. What went into that decision?
So the Gigafactory was another interesting problem that we had to solve in terms of scaling. And I think one of the key themes here we should spend a bit of time on is scaling and how to achieve scale with these different technologies. So after the Model S, we wanted to go another order of magnitude, 10x higher volume. So we had architected this thing called the Model 3, which is very much still the same one you can buy today. Really tried to drive down the price point, broaden adoption. We had a big launch event to try and sell them. But even before all of that happened, we started to kind of, again, do some internal math on the supply chain, and we were targeting 200 to 300,000 units a year. We thought that would be a stratospheric success. More EVs than anyone had ever sold ever, combined. It was pretty nuts to imagine that. But if we did that, the world would completely run out of batteries. So that was a kind of fundamental problem, which we had to fix. We couldn't just say, well, we'll build this car and hopefully batteries will be there, because that was literally doubling the entire world consumption of lithium-ion batteries at the time. All the laptops, cell phones, everything else combined, we had to double it. So that simple math said, okay, well, we need to conceive of this kind of new factory that has never existed, which will literally be larger than every battery factory in the world put together. And we also took that as an interesting opportunity to innovate how it was done and to vertically integrate more of the process, to industrialize it and drive the cost down faster. Because prior to that, we had been basically living off laptop batteries. We were sitting here trying to convince battery makers to ship us batteries instead of Dell, and I think we were actually causing shortages in the computer market, because the Model S was quite successful and people wanted to buy it, but that couldn't scale. So with that Gigafactory, we set out this audacious plan to say, okay, we're going to build this gigantic factory. We want to do it in the US, close to where we built the cars. So we had a big search. We chose northern Nevada as the location for that. This was kind of a crazy fun project that I took on and led for a lot of years, and I kind of got this little skunkworks team and sent them off to the desert in the sagebrush and said, okay, we're gonna build batteries in the desert. We convinced Panasonic to join us on this journey, which was pivotal. They invested billions of dollars in that and came and ended up building the cell part of it, and then Tesla built the entire facility and built the pack and modules and motors and power electronics. So that single factory was far from obvious that it would be successful, but over time really led to the cost advantage and the architecture, I think, of how, how Tesla, was able to drive down the price of the Model 3, and then that is essentially the Model Y, or evolved into the Model Y. And then that Gigafactory became the template that got, replicated in Shanghai and Berlin and, basically, and now Austin, of course, and around the world. So that's really, I think, cemented, I'd say, that the leading cost position.
So you mentioned scale-up, which obviously was a huge success in your case. We are actually out here thinking of developing a curriculum on scaling because that's normally what we don't teach that in academia, writ large, not just Stanford. So if you were, based on your experience on scaling, tell us what are the lessons learned that, just top 5 lessons learned that we should be including in a curriculum out here?
Well, I'd say first off, it's shockingly hard. And I almost every single engineer I've encountered, myself included, underestimates this dramatically. We're kind of taught in everything in labs and school and classes, you're kind of thinking about prototypes and projects and kind of 1 or 2 offs, and you kind of build something that you make it work. The gulf between that and building a million or a billion of that thing is really far and really hard. So, a few of the specific pieces I think that at least I never studied here, supply chain. I never even saw a class in supply chain. I don't think I even heard the term, frankly, until I was inside of Tesla. I was like, what the hell's a supply chain? I don't even know. Like, we need to buy things. Where do we get them? So I know this sounds kind of crazy, but it's not something that's frequently taught. So that was a big learning, was trying to understand that and figure out, how you can sort of work with all these other partner companies and the whole ecosystem in the world around us, to achieve scale. A lot of other lessons about, just the manufacturing environment and automation, how to really, what is inside of a factory? What does it take to make a million of something? There are a lot of technical problems. Fundamentally, it's a very technical engineering, science-driven thing, but they're sort of different disciplines, and you're looking at, kind of modeling of production lines and modeling of material flows through a factory. A lot of, kind of intelligent targeting of automation, of thinking, okay, well, how to integrate robots with material handling with humans, with maybe a nascent product design that might need to change over time. So anyway, a lot of these things, were sort of the crux of what made that difficult. And at Tesla, we had the benefit of a just world-class, engineering team. I think some of the best, talent in the world, and generally kind of uprooted a lot of these individuals, from their design engineering task and took them from Palo Alto in many cases and said, okay, well, we're going to go out to the desert and we need to fix this giant factory because it's not working right now. So, that was sort of part of the formula also of how we made that work. It was unconventional, and it wasn't really following the manufacturing team must solve that because it's a manufacturing thing. It's like, no, if we don't fix it, the whole company dies, so everyone's going to go fix it. Anyway, these
very interesting. So it's
stories.
I'm sure we will, I hope you help us in sort of developing this curriculum that we plan to do, because I think the impact of that on our current students could be profound in how they think about whether they want to launch a company or something else.
I'd be happy to help, and I think it's great seeing so many students get out also into the field. We try and welcome them at Redwood. We try and encourage them to go to factories, whatever factories they may be, because I think that's a really powerful part of this is just getting. Stanford's an amazing place. It's such a incredible cauldron of cool intellectual thought and diversity of classes and ideas, but it also is a bit of a bubble. And if you sort of stay in the bubble the entire time, you do miss some of that. So I really encourage people to get out there and see, factories, see scale, see what scale looks like in other industries, and how they're solving it or how they're struggling with it. Because I think that's incredibly important in energy and transportation and energy storage. Really, whatever the industry, when we're talking about these global problems, the scale is gargantuan. And in order to sort of move the needle on sustainability and energy at the global level, you have to build millions or billions of them. Somehow, someone does.
So let's talk about Redwood Materials. You were in Tesla for about 15 or 16 years, something like that. And then you decided to start something on battery recycling, which is Redwood Materials. Tell us about why you decided to do that, and what are the lessons learned from your Tesla experience that you brought in? And what are you learning? What are the new things you're learning now?
Well, at Redwood, we're focused on basically a closed-loop supply chain for batteries. It's one thing that I think that's just incredibly exciting about what's possible with batteries in an electric ecosystem that just isn't possible with a fossil fuel ecosystem. It's kind of obvious, but also not intuitive. When you have fossil fuels, you work really hard, we find them, we refine them, we feed it into a machine, it chemically converts, and then it's gone. There is no closed loop possible there because it's not energetically favorable. You'd have to recollect the CO2 and then reconvert it back to fossil. It's sort of a very energetic, and entropy is against you. But with a battery and an electric ecosystem, you mine all these materials, you work really hard to dig them out of the ground, the lithium, the nickel, and cobalt. We refine it, we put it into a battery, and it all stays there. It doesn't go anywhere. Every atom of those useful, critical materials just sits inside the car for its entire life, rides along wherever you go, and all of them are still there at the end of life. So there's now a possibility, technically, to recover and reprocess and remanufacture nearly 100%, 98, 99% of those materials, and keep them in a closed ecosystem, building back into a new generation of batteries in cars. Fueling that, powering that with renewable energy. So to me, that's a really, really compelling future vision. And that was kind of part of what I was so excited about, was seeing almost the inevitability of that future state, because you can't just throw them away. On the other hand, we're avoiding a pretty bad negative environmental outcome of throwing batteries into a landfill or something like this. So I think this will happen, it has to happen, but I saw no one working on it. And it was such an early time that really there were no good solutions for battery recycling, and we were struggling with that even in the beginning at Tesla. And it wasn't something we could focus on. I had customers constantly ask me, still today, people are passionate about this when they buy an EV, but most OEMs don't really have the time to focus on it. They're so busy trying to make more cars, make them cheaper, solve all the supply chain problems. So anyway, that was part of the thesis for Redwood for me, was envisioning this future and kind of seeing an inevitable future where over time, everything will be more and more closed loop with higher recycled content, yet no one was inventing it. And I thought, and we saw the chance to help architect this, the engineering pathways, the business pathways, the shipping, all of it. It's kind of architecting almost, in my view, what the oil industry might have looked like 100 years ago. Someone had to invent the idea that you're going to get oil out of the ground, and then you need to think of a refinery, and then you have to think of how does this refinery work, and how do you get these things that it makes out to these other things that people want to buy. It kind of feels like we're having to do that with batteries. There's a new ecosystem that needs to evolve, and we have to figure out what's a battery refinery look like, and what are the products from that, and where do they go, and how do we kind of reintroduce them into a supply chain that's useful.
So since you talked about fossil fuel, I know you're very passionate about a fossil-free future. Climate sustainability is very important to you. It is an urgent issue, as it is for many of us out here. Fossil-free future, I want you to talk about how do we get there. And this is a complicated thing because the 20th century paradigm is almost all 80% based on fossil fuel, yet we want to transition as quickly as possible. Any thoughts on how would you navigate?
Well, it is an incredibly complex and huge problem. I think my appreciation for just the difficulty of that and the scale of that has only grown over time. I've been working on fossil fuel, transition, I would say, for my whole career. I thought we would make faster progress, actually, as a society and as a planet on this. I also feel like I've kind of edged more toward almost like a an activist position, anti-fossil fuel position, as I've kind of gotten older and kind of moved through my career. You know, I really, you know, see so much of that kind of momentum, and maybe organizational and business momentum, you know, continuing on a status quo that I don't see an easy way to break out of on a kind of linear path. So, you know, I mean, said simply, we have to literally stop burning all fossil fuel to even have a hope of kind of starting to get to zero emissions, let alone starting to actually fix things.
So there are multiple industries involved. I mean, there's, of course, oil and gas that provides the fuel. There's cement and steel. There's agriculture. You know, how you make fertilizers is based on, you know, hydrogen. Hydrogen comes from fossil fuels, et cetera. So from your experience, you have done it, now you're doing it twice. You've done it in Tesla, you're doing it for batteries now, recycling batteries. Does there need to be like 10 Teslas out there that are starting off now in steel, cement, and how would you think about it?
I mean, I think entrepreneurship and startups are an incredible tool. It's a powerful tool, you know, to break a little bit of the paradigm and to, you know, accelerate change. You know, it's really hard to do that from within, you know, large companies that are structurally built, you know, around products and ecosystems. You know, they're designed not to change dramatically. I mean, that's success for them, is don't screw it up. You know, don't bankrupt it, don't drive it off a cliff. So I think it's a lot more than 10 Teslas, though. You know, I think, you know, literally it's more like 100 or maybe 1,000 globally. I mean, the scale of this is dramatic. It's really dramatic. You know, I mean, there's many different analogies we could try and use. I mean, one that I think about is, I mean, it's like, imagine you're in a hole. You know, to me, like being in the hole is sort of like, you know, the climate forcing gases that we're doing damage to the atmosphere, putting into the atmosphere. You know, we're like digging this hole, we're putting more, you know, gases in the atmosphere. And, you know, we're digging the hole super fast. You know, we're kind of arguing with each other to see if maybe we could get an agreement to only dig as fast as we were digging a few years ago. That's our definition of success in our negotiation right now, is maybe, like, let's only dig as fast as we were digging in like 2019, and then congratulate ourselves that we're only digging that fast. And actually, we're failing at that. We haven't even achieved that because we're digging at a record high rate. You know, worldwide, we just set a record at how fast we're digging last year. 1% or so fastest world record emission of carbon gases last year. Again, that's something I think that most people don't think about. It feels like, when you look around us, that like, it feels a little bit more like we're winning. You know, it's like, hey, EVs are doing pretty well. There's a lot of solar panels out there. I see more wind turbines. But even in the US, you know, we're coming down the emission curve very slightly in the US, but maybe 3% down, I think, last year. So
if you look at, for example, the automobile industry, it's about $2 to $3 trillion per year,
yep,
right? And Icho and I actually spent some time together talking about all the new things that are needed, right? Whether it is grid-scale storage, lithium-ion batteries, of course, whether it's greenhouse gas removal, which we have to do to maintain 2 degrees, or even 1.5 for sure, but certainly 2 degrees as well. You have many other, steel, cement. Each of them is $1 trillion industry, at least 1 trillion, if not more. So one way to think about it is that we are at the cusp of multiple trillion-dollar industries starting at the same time. Is that a fair statement in your mind?
Absolutely.
And should there be more JB Straubels now looking at how to disrupt?
Well, I don't know about that, but you know, I think we're absolutely at a moment in history when we have to reinvent everything. You know, there's never been an analog to this that I could ever see, and it all has to happen incredibly fast. So I'm not exactly sure how to do this, you know, but as I said, you know, I think entrepreneurship, innovation are really powerful tools. You know, they're the best tools that I know personally to deploy, and I think the sort of highest leverage ways that at least I think I can contribute. You know, maybe education is one, and entrepreneurship is another. So that's kind of what I try and do. But it needs so much more, and I think we all have to, if there's one thing, maybe it ties into the scale vision, is I think we have to think bigger. Everyone has to really, challenge yourselves to imagine, if you have an idea on how to attack sustainability, sort of challenge yourself on like, well, why can't it be 100 times bigger? And just say, well, what then? Like, imagine that, could that work? Could I go twice as fast and make it 100 times bigger? This is the kind of process I think, we have to do on every single idea.
So before we go into audience questions, which we have a whole stack of them out here, let's come back to Stanford. You graduated about 24, 25 years ago. Looking back, and now we have launched the first school in 75 years, with a vision to kind of reimagine academia in ways that can address this issue at speed and scale, not to use John Doerr's words. So what would be your recommendation? What would be your suggestion on how to think about it?
Well, I mean, the School of Sustainability is incredibly exciting. I'm so thrilled that this is happening and it's happening here. It's amazing. I think speed and scale are great words to deploy toward this. It's really the right way to think about what's needed. It isn't normally addressed, I would say, as well in the academic environment. So it's kind of a different lens on things. I see so many students incredibly passionate about this stuff. At Redwood, it's fascinating. With my Redwood kind of lens on, people immediately get what we're trying to do, and I'd say they get the vision. Students do, more so even than many adults. Or not that students aren't adults, but people who are later in their career. And it does remind me a little bit of the situation at Tesla, when in the early days, ironic, we'd see students who'd immediately get it. They'd love EVs. Even high school and grade school students would be trying to sell their parents on like, well, you need to buy an EV. Parents, like, why don't you buy this? And I kind of see a similar thing happening with circular supply chains and sustainability. But anyway, for the sustainability school, I think it's really kind of shifting the focus and making sure that people really consider scale, and they consider how to move an idea from innovation, whether it's in a lab or wherever it originates, into market relevant size. It doesn't mean the startup has to do that. It doesn't mean the individual has to do that. You don't have to be an expert at every piece of that. But I think it's kind of zooming out a little bit, and trying to envision at least the trajectory for these ideas, and use that as a bit of a filter, perhaps, for which ones to put more emphasis behind or more weight behind. So that's
so delighted to hear that, because it kind of confirms or reaffirms the whole idea of the accelerator that we have, which is, I call the third leg of the school, is really to think about scale from the beginning, and think about all the issues, not that you have to solve them, but at least you're walking into that unknown with having thought through at least.
It's critical, and I think it needs to be something that is a bit of a filter you apply when you start and launch ideas. At Tesla, we didn't solve them all in the beginning, but we did think a lot about it, and thought pretty hard about the likely tailwinds and trajectory of battery cost and availability, and the ecosystem that could be built around battery charging, and the efficiency from renewables to battery, and then efficiency from car to wheels to drive it. So there was a lot of architectural thought put into the scaling to say, okay, does this have the right physics behind it to allow it to scale? And that didn't mean solving it at all, but at least there weren't any physics roadblocks in the way. And I see tons of ideas, though, that actually still do have some physics roadblocks or chemistry roadblocks. And those are really tough.
It's very hard to.
They're really hard.
It's very hard to change the laws of physics.
Yeah. Not a good thing to try.
People have tried. Okay, so let's go to some of the questions from our students, faculty, and staff. This is on emerging global market. This is from Shivani Upadhyay, master students in GSB. What does the global recycling value chain look like for lithium products, particularly in emerging markets? Without collection centers and disposal practices, what incentives can we employ to encourage individuals and companies to recycle batteries? And this is similar to Rob Jackson, our faculty member, who said, how does and will Redwood collect batteries globally?
Yeah, it's the so-called sort of reverse logistics, and thinking about how do we go from consumer back into industry. It's kind of an interesting problem that hasn't been faced as much. It's very different depending on what the material is, first off. So a lot of material that needs to get recycled is actually production scrap. It's waste that happens when you make a battery. Most people don't even think about this, but something close to 10% of the material that goes into the manufacturing funnel for a battery is lost as yield or waste in the manufacturing process. So, and that's quite good. 90% yield in a complex manufacturing process is quite good. Another lesson learned, actually, by the way, in manufacturing is that yield is not 100%. So you have to deal with all the other aspects of yield not being 100%. In engineering school, usually you just kind of, it's like yield is 100. Why would it not be 100? But on the consumer side of bringing batteries back from consumers, this is very dispersed. And at Redwood, we partner with a lot of different companies, with nonprofits, with some auto dealerships, Audi and VW, with Rotary Club as a nonprofit. We're working with several other large retail stores to use those as basically the window that can touch a lot of people conveniently to start to get batteries back into the funnel. Now with EVs, it's a different thing altogether. So you probably don't want to drop your EV off at a retail store. So there we have built partnerships with junkyards, with auto dismantlers, also with OEMs to some degree, but it's quite complicated what happens to cars later in their life. It's not usually as simple as they just kind of come back to one place. Now internationally, I think there was another question about emerging markets. This is in some ways easier because people really value the economic recovery even more in some emerging markets. And it is very cash positive. It's valuable to recover these elements from consumer batteries. So if we can get that value all the way back into the people that can even be empowered to do the collection or bring batteries to some place, I think actually emerging markets could be higher percent recycling even than the developed markets. They are today with most other commodities. If you look at aluminum cans or bottles or cardboard, I mean, it's incredibly recycled. When you get to emerging markets where people value enormously, the little incremental revenue that can bring. In California, we incentivize, like heck. I mean, this thing has got probably a 5% cash refund. Nobody even knows it. Nobody cares. We're just sort of throwing money in the garbage. So I think in emerging markets, really harnessing that economic power for people to get some value and then enable them to help us get them back.
Well, the biggest battery manufacturer and the biggest user is China. Are you making inroads in China? Or do you have supply chain out there or reverse logistics?
China is, so the other aspect of this is international shipping. It is very complicated with batteries and with waste. Anything really defined as waste. So a lot of countries, most countries and regions have their own kind of bespoke rules, and they're sometimes asymmetric on what can leave versus what can come back in. China in particular is very rigid on this. They basically will not allow batteries to leave China. I don't know exactly the wording of the rule or the law, but functionally that's what it means. And
will you go into China?
You'd think that would
TBD.
you'd think that would be obvious, but China has put restrictions on waste coming in.
Oh, I see.
So for a while, I think China became almost like a dumping ground, and people were sending all kinds of cheap recycling in. So they reacted against that. But there's a lot of complexity, and when does something go from waste to product? If it has inherent value, this kind of challenges the whole idea of waste. So we kind of get all wrapped around the axle arguing, with basically import-export, authorities, of like, well, no, this is a product, it has value, and we've worked on it. Somebody else is going to continue working on it, but it came from garbage, so therefore it must be waste. So you can kind of like chase your tail on some of these things. It needs a bit of a policy solution.
Some quick answers to, this is from a bunch of undergraduate student and a master's student. Devin Agarwal, undergraduate student. I admire your passion. What is the advice for undergraduates who are also passionate with sustainability and want to take advantage of the right opportunity to achieve genuine impact? The next question from Mark Khalil, master students, MSNE. What's your next business idea?
Well, I'd say on the impact piece, it's really try and focus on the impact. I think sometimes it's very tempting to be, allured by kind of the trend or the fad at the moment. I mean, it's like AI everything right now, or CS, AI. I really try and focus on your true passion and on what can actually make an impact. Use that as a bit of a filter for where you spend your time. And if you mix, impact with what you're incredibly passionate about, I think that is a really powerful formula. In my career, this stuff, when I look back, it's like that's what I'm most proud of, what, was the most rewarding for me. It's not what made the most money. It's what made the biggest impact that I can see having, had a positive impact on a lot of people or a lot of products. So I'd really, whatever your passion is, wherever you can target your skills, I think that's a really key part of it. Next business idea, boy, I'm pretty heads down with Redwood materials right now. I love being an entrepreneur. It's part of why, I decided to leave Tesla, which was an incredibly hard decision. I've kind of like half left because I'm back on the board there. But I really love, the scrappy kind of, hustle almost, like the contrarian nature of being an entrepreneur. And, I'm having fun with that at Redwood right now. It's a great vehicle to do that and to attract people that kind of, also love that environment.
So here's a question from a master's student in civil and environmental engineering. What are the next leapfrogs in technology development? What about aviation? Going back to Volacom, would you start that now?
Ooh, probably not, but this is true with like most entrepreneurship. You probably would not do things twice, which is, maybe a benefit of why, people will do it the first time when you don't know what you don't know. Electric aviation is really hard. There's a lot of great companies doing this, but I see so many more, industries that are very low-hanging fruit that should be electrified, where I'm like, why in the earth hasn't this been electrified yet? And it's just not happening for some reason. Whereas aviation is incredibly difficult. It needs the highest energy density, really, perfect safety, on storage. And these are, not impossible, but they're tough goals. And it's going to take, more chemistry developments and some core R&D before we can get, much more competitive electric aviation. But meanwhile, why doesn't everyone have, an electric lawnmower? Like, literally, why does anyone still have a gas lawnmower? It just befuddles me. It's like I don't understand why that product even exists anymore. Or really any small gasoline engines. It's just the market there is crazy. So anyway, I think there's a lot of companies to be started, attacking, things that have, gone way past the tipping point of commercial and better products, but just they haven't been implemented well, or they're facing some resistance in the market.
So the advice to the student: question the norms if you really want a paradigm shift in this.
Absolutely, I think that's a theme.
So before we end, some quick 1- or 2-word answers, and this is you as JB for people to know. Best cuisine, your favorite cuisine.
Food. Geez, I don't know. Pasta?
Pasta,
okay. I'll go with pasta.
Favorite sports team?
Oh, boy, I really don't. I just...
No.
Maybe.
This is not in the...
I mean, one of the things you have to give up some things when you're like a passionate entrepreneur. I sort of chose, like, in my life, certain things that I give up. And sports for me is kind of one of those, it's like the most awkward conversation when I do business dinners and people are like, so, like, how about that team? And I'm like, yeah, I hope they do well.
Best vacation you have taken?
Vacation.
I hope you do take vacation.
Galapagos. I went to Galapagos once. Highly recommend.
We're talking about sustainability. That's a great way to end this conversation. This could have gone on. This is like having a conversation, drinking glasses of wines out here. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Let's give them a big round of applause.